Today's guest is Robert Norton, a master strategist and scaling expert who's built not one but two companies to over $100 million in revenue, each in just 5 years. With over 200 companies advised, 4 books, and thousands of CEOs trained across 40-plus countries, Bob's insights into leadership, innovation, and organizational transformation are unmatched. In this episode, we explore the critical difference between automation and intelligence, how to successfully navigate change with AI inside complex organizations, and why unconscious competence, not surface-level expertise, is the real driver of innovation. Bob also shares his 3-layer AI implementation framework and explains why great companies grow through differentiation, innovation, and mastering context. If you're thinking about scaling, transforming your org with AI, or just becoming a sharper leader, this conversation is packed with wisdom you won't want to miss. Let's dive in. Welcome. I'm here with my buddy Bob Norton. And I got to say, I think we have a really interesting conversation here today. But Bob, I want to start it off by thanking you being on the show. And additionally, what is it that got you interested in the intersection of humanity and technology?
Well, great to be here. Thank you. I think the study of psychology and human beings must be part of the curriculum and focus of any manager and any leader because, in any world, AI controlled or not, you have to understand the psychology of people and what motivates them. The father of management, Peter Drucker, created goal-setting system called management by objective, which research shows increases people's productivity and value creation in corporations by 56%, which of course you would compound annually looking at the growth of a business. So any manager or aspiring manager needs to study psychology. And of course, they also need to understand technology today that's going to touch everything, especially with this new wave of generative AI, where essentially everyone can and should be assisted in the work they do because essentially they have a very cheap, almost free assistant that can do a lot of the boring work of research. I like to look at ChatGPT and other generative tools, and I mean this literally as a dumb assistant that can do lots of work quick. And, because essentially they can find all the facts, but it's still lacking real intelligence. I would even say literally AI today has no intelligence yet because it has no context and it has no imagination, which is the definition of intelligence put forward by Einstein. And so without the context of what's the world context, the company context around that conversation, I think we're going to push past that limitation, in the next few years. I don't disagree with Ray Kurzweil and others, but I think reaching the singularity is kind of a semantic argument because no one's really defined what it means yet, right? It's not the Turing test because we're way beyond that in terms of being able to fool someone, in a text conversation. And I think it's a spectrum. It's not a day or an event that we can define because there kind of is no definition of it. So I think it's an interesting time. May you live in interesting times, right? There's so much that's going to happen, and everyone has to adjust and leverage it because if you don't, your competitors will. Do you want to hear a little bit about my background for context and talk about
Absolutely,
context?
Bob.
Yeah. The short version of my career is I was a technologist for 8 years, ending as VP of engineering and chief technical officer for what today is Thomson Reuters. It was Thomson Financial Services. We're going way back to a previous lifetime in the 80s when I ran the Skunk Works there and did all product development. And my claim to fame is I launched 5 products in 5 years, every one of which became a $20 to $30 million business within a couple of years, which in today's dollars, you'd probably have to double or triple that for, the compound inflation. And I sort of independently invented a lot of the Lockheed Martin Skunk Works methodologies So my development team had 11 times the industry average productivity. And that financial success really allowed us to go out and buy other companies and grow very rapidly. Those products were in the Wall Street financial services community. After that 8 years of product development, and I'm still a product guy and a scientist, I spent 14 years as a serial entrepreneur. I founded 4 companies and sold them for over $1 billion total. So that was sort of my serial entrepreneur years. And now for a little over 20 years, I've been advising as a trusted advisor for CEOs and boards, um, coaching and mentoring CEOs. And we've developed 3 brands: the CEO Bootcamp intensive training program, uh, Entrepreneurship University, which is a training platform for managers at growth entrepreneurial companies, and Airtight Management, which is built on top of all of that IP, which is the most comprehensive leadership operating system. So I come at this from management and leadership, which is obviously the people component, but also a very strong product orientation. And, I think that's consistent with another Peter Drucker axiom, which I think everyone needs to think about. And that is, companies have 2 jobs: innovation and marketing. And that's where the creativity and the critical thinking need to be combined to create real disruption and differentiation in a business to grow it. And if you're not doing those, you're not going to grow. And sort of everything else can be outsourced. Sort of everything else is a little more generic, and it doesn't require as much creativity. Accounting is accounting. Doesn't matter what industry you're in. Everything generates a P&L and a balance sheet and the tax forms, and it's generic, right? And sometimes operations is like that too. It doesn't mean you can't outperform, by doing great execution at some of those other things. But the only companies that will ever grow fast are ones that have and attract capital, which is needed to grow fast, are going to be the ones that have high differentiation and protection of that differentiation. And usually that's in innovation and marketing.
How do you look at innovation in, like, let's say, startup organizations, right? Like, because if you are a startup, you're basically trying to do one thing, and it may be an innovative idea, but can you measure innovation of an organization that is, only been doing it once?
Yes, I would strongly suggest that you should have no competitors upon your market entry. And that may sound like a tall order, but I do mean it literally. I don't mean it as hyperbole. Your niche that you're going into, you better be doing something that everyone else can't do. And Jim Collins would call that the hedgehog concept. The MBAs would call it your differentiation on a competitive landscape map, or the white space, right? It means you're focusing on developing being the best in the world at something other people can't do, at least in that niche. And that plan of your market entry strategy has to grow. It may be growing into a portfolio of niches or larger vertical and horizontal markets. But no company I've ever known, and I challenge people with this all the time, and they never come back with an answer, has grown massively and become a unicorn without starting in a niche, right? Airbnb started going after cities that sold out their hotels at conventions. Okay. That was how they identified their most in the pain customers, right? They
Yeah.
didn't say we have all the hotels. They couldn't, right? The scale needed to open the market there would be too large, right? So as a startup, you got to eat the elephant one bite at a time. And that first bite is a very small niche. It shouldn't be something that's more than $100 or $200 million probably, and that guarantees you're not competing with the 800-pound gorillas in the world, and gets you established as a beachhead so that you're going to remain differentiated, because the big companies don't care about the small niches. But then you can, as we did many times in the strategy, is enter more smaller markets, leveraging that same differentiator or technology or innovation, whatever you want to call it, and you start building a portfolio of niches strategy where you have no competitors. And that gives you pricing power, and it gives you more efficiency in the sales and marketing as well.
I think it's a really good piece of feedback for our startup community as far as being able to find your niche that is that, the $100 million problem that you're solving in a, $50 billion marketplace.
Find the most painful customer, right? That's suffering the most, because big companies don't want to trust startups and take risks, and sometimes even do pilots, unless it's a pretty high pain. And some people say 10x, but it's really a spectrum, in terms of how much better you have to be. If you're 100% differentiated, no one else is offering that, solving that problem, 2x is enough, right? In terms of your ROI to them, and whatever other metrics they might look at for solving that problem.
Okay. Where do you, I mean, we've had a couple good years with AI as far as like the hype of it. And then additionally, like I think individual contributors are using it on a frequent basis. And then we're starting to see some, general business use cases that are coming out as far as solutions. And then additionally, seeing customer service agent bots that are, fairly prevalent today for larger corporations as well. Where do you see us in the innovation life cycle for AI today?
Yeah, actually, I was just researching this with AI yesterday for one of my clients, helping them out, and I'm bringing up a couple of bar charts I created from AI. And the adoption today, obviously that curve is very rapid, but you're looking at somewhere in the area of 40 million people that are using AI today, according to this data. And of course, never trust AI 100% without going to the source. That the hallucinations have gone away quite a bit since ChatGPT 3, and moving on to 4, but you've got to check the data. But that 40 million, or maybe it's 50 that have kind of tried it. Remember, we're talking about people who try it, not use it every day regularly. So I think a lot, you really got to look at the data, because everyone's going to try something. The question is, are they really integrating it into the customer's or company's workflow as a regular part? But that 40 to 50 million is expected to become near 200 million. So 5 times as much by 2030.
Yep.
So that's as rapid a growth curve and an adoption curve as you've ever seen. I don't know if you've seen some of the growth curves, but this one's straight up. If you look at the internet, it's exponential, right? Over 10 years or 5 years or whatever. But, when Chat GPT came out, it really took over, because there's perceived creativity. As we were talking a little bit before starting the call, I don't believe there's any intelligence in AI yet. And that may sound like a weird thing to say, but intelligence, as defined by Einstein, is creativity. And
Yeah.
by definition, a large language model is just a huge database of sentences other people have said that were scraped from the internet. So by definition, there is nothing new in there. It looks new to us because we don't know all those facts. But the
Yep.
reality is it's just a big blender of people's previous thoughts.
It, I mean, it's an interesting concept to go down because I do agree with you that there isn't really creativity coming from these models. The other two areas that I say that we're not seeing, these models perform well is strategy, and then additionally relationships. They
Yeah,
aren't
because both of
capable.
them require huge context.
Exactly,
Now, as I
right?
said, I
Like,
think we'll solve that problem soon. Notebook AI and Gemini from Google have massively expanded the context window, and
yeah,
now can have, I believe, 5 million words.
yeah, it's like
And
2 million or 5 million tokens.
it's 5 million. And most of the previous ones were 50,000 or 100,000. So, that's a huge leap forward in context. But remember, you still have to load that context for, there to be sort of any intelligence around what's the environment I'm asking the question for. I would say to any CEO, If you don't say what the time frame you're talking about is for a meeting, you can be arguing with each other, and one person's right on the 5-year time frame, and another person's right on the 1-year time frame, and they're going at it like cats and dogs, and they're both right because they haven't synchronized on what are we really talking about? What's the context, you know?
And I think you're correct that context windows increasing is one way. But I also think that we have like other solutions available, such as like RAG, which can play, a long-term memory type of approach, but there's still development that needs to be done on the context of that, as well as like my favorite example is if you're using RAG, you're basically parsing sentence by sentence. You can parse paragraph by paragraph. There's other parsing places to go, but if I have two sentences, one says this, the capital of Germany is Berlin, and then the second sentence is the city has a population of X number of million of people, right? If I am not parsing that information and storing it in an effective way, I lose the context that the city being discussed is Berlin for that second sentence.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, I mean, this is a much more tactical kind of thing, but I think it highlights the nuance of what needs to be done in order to hold context.
Yeah. Let me give you a data point on context. If you do the math on information bits flowing into the human mind, by the age of 4, they have processed more bits than everything on the internet together. Now, that's not an apples to apples comparison, but the reality is every person that sits down at that computer has way more context of the world and how it operates. The question is, does it have the right context around the question or the problem you're working around? And so it's up to you to load that context and make sure there's all the expert opinion in that context, as opposed to, random thoughts put out there by, people on the internet that, don't help because they're not expertise. We're going to have a lot of fake experts in the world now because you can basically sit down and generate a course in 5 minutes on anything you know nothing about.
Yep. And it is an amazingly helpful tool to kind of extend our own capabilities. And then also at the same time, the problem is that we're losing the depth of experts in any one field that have that 20 plus years of experience or have kind of seen the other scenarios and know the ditches to walk over, know the rivers that you can't cross.
Yeah, I'm familiar with the book Blank and Malcolm Gladwell's 4-level model of learning. That's a direct parallel. I actually, before he came out with that book, I had something I called the Wisdom Pyramid, which I did at the very first CEO boot camp in 2004. But, he just named it better and, wrote a whole book for however many years he spent on it. For me, it was one slide as framing, how do you know when to trust information from a source? How do
Yeah.
you know, in interviewing an employee, where they are on the expertise spectrum? And so Malcolm Gladwell's model is unconscious incompetence. You don't know what
Yep.
you don't know. Conscious competence, you've understood how ignorant you are. Conscious incompetence is you're ignorant and you know it. Conscious competence, which means you can struggle through it. So it's sort of the beginning, the first year of doing something new. And of course, we're talking about complex tasks and art here, not digging a ditch.
Yep.
That takes some time. And then, of course, ultimately, where we now have a lot of scientific neuroplasticity data is reaching the ultimate level, which is unconscious competence, which means it's reflexive for you. And you've actually built a supercomputer in your head that just does just that thing, that has massive power. And that's where the title of the book Blink comes from, because you can do something in a blink that someone else couldn't do working on it for months because of that collective experience. And that's happening at an unconscious level. The examples in the book talk about this in the statue, where, the Rand Corporation bought a statue for $10 million. And then they hired the world's top expert to look at it. And he said in the blink of an eye, well, that's a fake. Well, what's interesting is he didn't know why he knew it was a fake, proving it was his subconscious that knew it was a fake. It took him a little while to figure out, well, what is it that my intuition tells me that I know this is a fake? And it turned out to be the grain tint on the mold was wrong.
Interesting. And I think that's a great kind of like paradigm for where we're at with AI inside of an organization as well. Like we are like the way that we look at it is as we're bringing in automation and agentic AI into solutions, to not just look at it from the here's the task that's accomplished, but to think about who would be the right person to do this task and then to build the models in cohort with that.
Yeah, I tell every manager to read Blake because it's a model you can use in everyday life. Uh, Up leveling your employees by understanding where they are today and what they need to do to move up, hiring people, and weighting decisions because a CEO's main job is to put their ego aside and say, who should have the biggest vote on this decision? Mine shouldn't be the biggest vote because I don't know anywhere near as much marketing as my CMO does, or anywhere as much engineering as my CTO does, right? And so it's not a democracy. I've got to be smart enough to know where is everyone on the expertise curve around this problem and discussion to make a smart decision. And that's that's a level 5 leader that's putting their
Yeah.
own ego and opinion aside to properly look at a data-driven decision and the right experts given more weight in it.
Where do you see that we're at on the hype curve for AI right now?
I think there's sort of a consensus now that we've sort of reached the peak and maybe even a little over the hill. Um, there's amazing thing that's going to happen, and it's the most rapid adoption curve of anything ever since ChatGPT launched. And I think that we've got a long way to go, probably 10 years of implementing this. So it's kind of like the internet in 1995, right? Everyone, everyone, but that means you can't say, what are we going to do about it? And think you're done, right? Because it's potentially going to touch every department in your company and every workflow in your company. And so I created a 3-step model to deal with that for companies that's designed to answer the question, what do we do first or what do we do next? And I think that's a useful thing because off the shelf tools for individuals are really easy to implement and see what what the value or the productivity boost can be. There's not a lot of investment, there's not a lot of risk. And so everyone ought to be doing that now. As I said earlier, probably every employee with any kind of thinking and knowledge in their job ought to be using a GPT product or multiple GPT products. The next level is going to impact the workflow of a team. And that's where you might have to string things together and chunk them and use APIs to call on AI. And a lot of that will be implemented by the big tools. Your CRM is going to, make a call to a GPT to generate an email or say when to call someone and stuff like that. So a lot of that might happen by the software stack you're already using and everyone implementing AI into it.
It's interesting. I mean, look, we do a lot of work with those tools, but for the context problem that we've been talking about, I find that the bigger tools or like the purpose-built tools for that work suite, whether it's the CRM, whether it's Google Gemini inside of your workspace, Box AI, Salesforce, I can't remember the name of their tool. I think it's Merlin.
Yeah.
Um, they tend to be context aware of their own solution and less context aware of your business. And so it's very much like pulling a consultant off the street and asking for advice right there. You're going to get some good advice, but it's not applicable to you in that moment, or it is less applicable.
Yeah, and another way to say that in a tech speak way is that the context problem is solved by you having your own local LLM, right? If
Yeah.
if your LLM on the edge and NVIDIA has that $300 processor and it just announced a whole new line of AI dedicated processors with, 120,000 megaflops of processing or whatever, obviously is a big spectrum what you can buy. But I think that allows every business to build its own LLM that, begins to solve that context problem. It doesn't solve it for the two problems you pointed out of strategy, because strategy requires context of the whole world or the whole market landscape and global economic warfare and, all of that stuff, right? But it solves the problem of what do I say to this customer
Yeah.
in this sales cycle at this point?
Exactly. It can help you, it can guide you, right? But then at the same time, when it comes to that strategy, when it comes to relationships and creativity, at least the way that we do it is we utilize the AI so that the person can spend more time on those three activities
Mhm.
instead of being limited by it. Um, what's the what advice would you give to, executives and entrepreneurs as far as if they're making investments in this space, like going through that three-step process that you were talking about?
Well, let's finish off what step 3 is, because that's really building out your own AI,
Yeah.
right? And you might buy some products off the shelf and stick them together and load your own LLM. So, we were talking about that as we went into building better context for your problem, because that's getting a lot more custom, right? So that's step 3. And that takes a long time. I think it's going to take 5 or 10 years, just like it did for the internet to kind of get fully distributed and grab. I think it was 20 years before e-commerce on the internet exceeded e-commerce in retail a few years back,
Yeah.
and then COVID made it, make another big run up, right? So the question is, when do you do each? And that's obviously a context specific problem. You've got to figure out what's the ROI on each of those and prioritize it to go after the low fruit. And I think the Pareto principle, as always, will apply, that potentially 80% of the value will come from 20% of the work. So the leadership's job is to figure out what that 20% is to do first, and to have a plan that doesn't overwhelm people or disrupt the existing business, to sort of phase in the use of AI, and probably in every knowledge-based workflow, and that has risk and investment associated with it.
Absolutely. Um, we're talking about basically, bringing the LLM into your own four walls, and like we like to call that like treating it like an employee kind of capacity, right? Like you're building that context, you're building that brand awareness, it understands your workflows, understands your way of doing business that is your differentiator. And I know in our pre-show we were talking about the things that really make a business is how are you innovating, and then your marketing as well. And this is what you had shared with me. How do you see the technology playing into that space?
Yeah, I mean, the basis of that is a quote from Peter Drucker that says a company has two jobs: marketing and innovation. And the deep thinking around that is those are the two areas that require a combination of intellectual analysis and understanding of business, and driving creativity in terms of your product or your service to be differentiated, right? So I think most of leadership's focus needs to be on those things, because that's where you get the horsepower to grow more quickly. Your accounting's the same. You can't, obviously you can use AI tools to look at a balance sheet and point out errors and do stuff like that, but it's probably not going to be anywhere near as impactful as what you do for your customers that is innovative for them. So, I think a focus on marketing innovation is there. I'm surprised more tools have not hit the market yet, and I'm hopeful they will this year, that help with lead generation and nurturing and that sort of thing. And, of course, the infrastructure out there is massive for, drip emails and funnels and all of this stuff. And for that to get dispersed into all of these very complex systems takes a lot of time, but I'm expecting there's going to be some movers and shakers that will do a great job at that and make it worth kind of leapfrogging to the next system. Some of these will be just injecting AI along the path of the workflow, and some of them will be, okay, this is so different. We've sort of got to do a migration to a brand new system.
Absolutely. Bob, I got to say, thank you so much for having this conversation today. It's been a blast having you on. Any last parting words for our audience as far as, well, really anything about life?
Well, I like your model of thinking as AI as an employee. You know, as I said, I think of it as a stupid one because it's an intern. It doesn't have the context of the world and your problems. It only knows what you tell it. So you've got to focus on loading that context before you ask it the questions. And there's some very basic prompt, strategies you need to use that, because one person asking the same question in a different way is obviously going to get a very different answer. But in closing, I think AI is like the internet in 1995. We can't imagine all the things that it's going to do and it's going to impact, but you've got to constantly be looking for those opportunities that will create competitive advantage at all levels, the competitive space level in your competitive market landscape strategically, right down to every individual that doesn't want to change. We all know change is hard and people don't do it, and it has a high failure rate. So, you've got to feed and nurture your employees and prompt them along and show them how to change, because there's always resistance to change. Interestingly, McKinsey just came out with a report that about 85% of organizational change management programs fail to achieve their objectives, which is the exact same benchmark we had back in the 1980s from the book Re-engineering the Organization. So in 40 years, we have not gotten better at getting organizations to change the way they do business.
I think this is hopefully AI can be the reflection point of, at least calling us on our own bullshit. Cause I can tell you in early 2000s, I saw the same stats as well. And so it's really nice to see that the stat was presented as something like 80% of projects fail to meet their, budget, scope, or timeliness kind of area. So
Yeah, and let me throw in one more sentence, because this is the solution to that problem that we've figured out in the last decade. Training alone fails 90% of the time. Coaching alone will fail, and typically only works well with an individual, not a culture and an organization. And consulting alone has a more than 50% failure rate, because the consultants aren't the people executing, and oftentimes the experience and the skill set and the horsepower needed to execute the plan the consultant comes with fails. But when you do all three of those together, which is what we do with airtight management, you can get 100% success rate, because
yeah,
you're giving them the foundation, the philosophy, the language. You're holding the hand with the coaching to cross the bridge of change, and you're doing the hard work of analytics and creativity and critical thinking to make sure what you're implementing works in the context of what you're doing, sometimes with a small pilot, and sometimes, obviously iteration is necessary. But I think you've got to look at any AI implementation as having the combination of training, coaching, and consulting.
thank you. I really appreciate taking the time with you today again, Bob.